The moment I realized my life was about to split into before and after did not come with shouting or tears. It came with a number on a screen, a number that did not belong to my bank account, and yet somehow had my last name attached to it. I remember laughing at first, because when reality hits too hard, the brain reaches for humor like a life jacket. I always believed betrayal arrived loudly with dramatic confessions, or a neighbor knocking at the door. I was wrong. Betrayal arrived quietly through a payroll app on a Tuesday morning while I was drinking burnt coffee and pretending I liked my job. My wife was asleep upstairs, peaceful, relaxed, like someone with no secrets. I had trusted her completely, which is usually the first mistake in stories like this. My name is Daniel, and this is how I learned that loyalty can be negotiated like a bonus, and dignity sometimes has to be reclaimed publicly. Before you judge me, stay with me, because this story does not move the way you think it will. I did not catch them together. I did not read messages filled with romance. What I found was colder and somehow worse. A transfer labeled performance adjustment recurring monthly, higher than her salary increase, and approved by one man, only her boss. A man who shook my hand at office parties and asked about my hobbies like we were equals. I worked in data analytics, which means patterns speak to me louder than words, and this pattern screamed, I checked dates, cross-referenced pay cycles, and slowly a truth formed that made my stomach feel hollow, but my mind razor-sharp. My wife had been earning more, not by working more, but by agreeing to something that never shows up in official job descriptions. When I asked her casually that evening how work was going, she smiled too fast and said fine, then asked me why I looked tired. That was confirmation enough. I did not explode. I did not accuse. I thanked her for dinner and washed the dishes. Because when someone underestimates you, the best response is preparation. That night, while she slept, I backed up files, screenshots, transaction histories, approval chains, and calendar overlaps. I felt calm, which surprised me because anger is expected, but clarity is far more powerful. People think revenge is loud, but the most effective kind is quiet and documented. Over the next weeks, I watched, listened, and learned. I learned how a respected executive manipulated authority into leverage, and how my wife convinced herself it was just business, just temporary, just harmless. I learned that money has a way of rewriting moral boundaries, especially when ambition whispers that no one will ever know. She was wrong, I knew, and once I knew I could not unknow it. I also knew something else important. I was not going to beg, I was not going to scream, and I was not going to protect people who had no intention of protecting me. Instead, I built a timeline airtight, clean, and undeniable. Every transfer, every approval, every closed-door meeting aligned like a confession written in numbers. What they did not realize is that systems remember everything, and I am very good at making systems talk. The first twist in this story is that I did not confront either of them when I had the proof. I waited because timing matters more than truth. While they planned bonuses and vacations, I planned something else entirely. Something legal, something irreversible, and something public. And as I lay next to my wife, listening to her breathe evenly, I understood that the end of a marriage does not start with hate. It starts with acceptance. Acceptance that the person beside you is no longer on your side. And once that realization settles in, the rest becomes strategy. This is only the beginning, and the next step would change all our lives in ways none of them saw coming. People assume waiting is passive, but waiting can be the most aggressive move on the board. While my wife laughed at her phone and told me stories about meetings that never happened. I was building a version of myself that did not need her approval or her lies. I kept playing the role of the supportive husband, because camouflage works best when it looks familiar. Every morning I kissed her goodbye and wished her luck at work, and every night I added another layer to the archive. Emails, approvals, internal policy clauses, ethics guidelines, and bonus structures that clearly stated what performance meant and what it absolutely did not mean. I was not hunting scandal, I was assembling context, because context is what turns suspicion into fact. Her boss, whose name I will let fade into irrelevance, had a public image polished like glass panels in the lobby. He funded charity runs, spoke at leadership conferences, and loved the word integrity. I used to admire him, which now feels embarrassing, but also instructive. Never trust anyone who markets their morals louder than their work. The second twist arrived when I realized this was not an isolated arrangement, but a pattern. There were others before my wife, and there would have been others after. Promotions unexplained, raises, quiet resignations, all orbiting the same office floor. Suddenly, this was no longer just about my marriage. It was about exposure. I requested information through channels I was allowed to access, and when access was denied, I documented the denial itself because silence is also data. At home, my wife sensed distance and mistook it for stress. She suggested a weekend away, said we needed to reconnect, and I smiled and agreed, because nothing reveals truth faster than comfort. That weekend, she talked about the future house's promotions and how lucky we were, and I listened like someone hearing a radio in another room. When she fell asleep, I stepped outside, stared at the city lights, and realized something important. I was not losing anything valuable, I was shedding weight. Betrayal tries to make you feel small, but perspective reverses gravity. The plan was simple but precise: release everything at once, so no one could contain it. Human resources, compliance, social platforms, legal oversight boards, all informed within the same hour. People panic when they cannot control narrative flow. The third twist was emotional, not tactical. I did not feel rage anymore. I felt pity for my wife, because she believed power would protect her and did not understand that borrowed power always comes with a receipt. Days before launch, she came home excited, told me her boss hinted at another adjustment, said we were finally getting ahead, and I looked at her and almost told her everything out of mercy. Almost. But mercy without accountability is just silence with better branding. Instead, I asked one question. "Do you trust him?" She answered instantly. Yes, and that answer sealed her fate more than any document I had collected. The night before everything went public, I slept better than I had in months because truth has weight, and I was finally ready to drop it. When morning came, I pressed send, then shut my laptop and went for a walk because once you release truth, you do not need to watch it work. My phone started vibrating within minutes, but I ignored it because consequences do not require an audience. By noon, the company had issued a statement, vague, defensive, and already too late. Screenshots do not care about public relations. By evening, my wife was home early, pale, confused, holding her phone like it might explode. She asked what was happening, and I told her calmly everything. Not with anger, not with tears, just facts lined up like mirrors. She tried to explain, tried to justify, said it was complicated, and I said no, it was transactional, and that simplicity frightened her more than shouting ever could. She asked if we could fix this, and I said that question should have been asked before you made me a footnote in your negotiations. That night she slept in the guest room, and for the first time in years, the house felt honest. The story was now in motion, and there was no pause button left to press. The morning after, truth went public, felt strangely ordinary, which taught me that chaos is often louder online than it is in real kitchens, with sunlight on the counter. My wife avoided my eyes moving through the house like a guest who overstayed and finally noticed. My phone kept buzzing with messages from people who suddenly remembered my name and wanted to say they were sorry or impressed or curious. I answered none of them because commentary is a distraction, and I had work to do. The company placed her boss on immediate leave, which is corporate language for "we believe you, but we need lawyers to confirm it." She asked me if this was really necessary, and I asked her if the money was. That silence lasted longer than any argument we ever had. She tried a new angle, saying everyone does it, saying I was being dramatic, saying I was ruining lives. And I told her calmly that I had not ruined anything, I had only removed the curtain and let light finish the job. The fourth twist came when I received an email from the legal department asking to speak with me not as a husband but as a witness. They wanted details, timelines, authentication, and I gave them everything because when you choose transparency, you do not negotiate with fear. During that meeting, I realized how fragile authority becomes when it is documented. Men who once decided salaries now asked permission to ask questions. Meanwhile, at home, the emotional bargaining began, promises, therapy, apologies framed as growth. I listened politely because respect does not disappear just because trust does. She asked if I ever loved her, and I said yes, which confused her because she expected anger, not honesty. Love does not excuse behavior, and clarity does not require cruelty. The house filled with tension that had nowhere to hide, and every shared object became a reminder of how we arrived here through small compromises dressed up as ambition. She said she felt trapped. And I said being trapped does not justify building an exit with someone else's dignity. Another twist arrived when media outlets picked up the story, not for the affair, but for the system behind it. Whistleblower protections, internal oversight failures, and suddenly my name was attached to reform instead of revenge. That irritated my wife more than anything because she wanted this to be personal, not structural. She wanted a fight, not a lesson. One evening, she broke down crying, saying she felt used, and I nodded, because that was finally true. I told her being used does not erase the fact that you agreed to the terms and cashed the checks. She asked what I wanted now, and I said peace and paperwork. The word divorce hung in the air like a quiet bell, and when I said it out loud, she stopped crying instantly, which told me everything I needed to know. She was not grieving us. She was losing leverage. We met with lawyers separately, and the process began, methodical, unemotional, and fair. I did not ask for punishment. I asked for separation of paths and accountability of assets. Another revelation surfaced when her boss resigned before termination, which is the professional equivalent of running before the door locks. His career did not end in flames. It ended in silence, which is worse for someone who feeds on attention. Friends took sides. Some disappeared and some surprised me by staying neutral, which I respected. I learned that integrity attracts fewer people but better ones. Through it all, I maintained routines, gym mornings, work, focus, evenings, walks. Because structure is how you tell your nervous system that you are safe. My wife tried once more to reconnect, saying we could start over somewhere new. And I smiled sadly and said, "New locations do not erase old choices." The day the divorce papers were signed, there was no celebration, just relief, like exhaling after holding your breath for too long. As we walked out, she asked if I hated her, and I said no, I just no longer participate. That distinction is everything. The story was far from over, but the center of it had shifted from exposure to evolution, and I was ready for whatever came next. Once the legal dust began to settle, something unexpected happened. The noise faded, and in that quiet space I could finally hear my own thoughts again. I had spent so long reacting that choosing felt unfamiliar, but also powerful. My ex-wife moved out, taking boxes and memories, and leaving behind a house that felt larger but lighter. I did not rush to fill the silence, because silence is not emptiness, it is information. The company released a final report, confirming misconduct policy violations, and a series of quiet settlements that never reached headlines but changed internal rules permanently. I was offered anonymity but declined, because accountability only works when it has a face, and I was no longer afraid of being seen. The fifth twist came when I received an invitation to speak not about betrayal but about data ethics, transparency, and how numbers reveal behavior long before confessions do. Standing on a stage talking about integrity without preaching felt surreal but also grounding. I did not tell the story for sympathy, I told it as a case study, and that shift gave it weight. Meanwhile, my ex attempted to rewrite the narrative, online posting vague messages about healing and being misunderstood, and I ignored them because competing stories only dilute truth. People reached out privately saying they recognized similar patterns in their own lives, and that was enough. One afternoon, I ran into her boss at a coffee shop, or rather the former version of him. He looked smaller, not physically, but structurally, like a building after tenants leave. He tried to speak, and I nodded politely, and kept walking because closure is not a conversation. It is a decision. Another unexpected development arrived when my employer offered me a leadership role focused on compliance analytics, which felt like life-turning irony into opportunity. I accepted not out of revenge but alignment. I was no longer hiding what I was good at. Evenings became reflective instead of tense, and I rediscovered humor in small things like cooking for one or choosing paint colors without debate. Occasionally loneliness tapped on the window, but it never moved in because loneliness only settles where purpose is absent. My ex reached out once more asking if we could talk as friends, and I declined gently because boundaries are not punishments, they are maintenance. She had mistaken access for connection, and I was done explaining the difference. The story continued to ripple outward. Policies changed, conversations shifted, and people learned that exploitation does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it wears a badge and smiles. I realized that winning is not about humiliation. It is about clarity and momentum. The most satisfying outcome was not her regret or his downfall. It was my own unshakable calm. The final twist was internal. I no longer needed the story to validate me because I had outgrown it. What began as exposure ended as direction, and as I stood in my quiet living room looking out at a city that did not know my name, I felt something rare: contentment built on truth and self-respect. There was still more ahead, but for the first time, I was walking forward, not reacting backward, and that made all the difference. Time has a way of testing whether lessons actually stick, or if they were just temporary slogans we repeat while things are raw. Months passed, and the story slowly stopped being news and started becoming background noise, which is where truth usually belongs. I noticed people treated me differently, not with pity, but with a careful respect. Like they were unsure which version of me they were meeting, the betrayed husband or the man who refused to disappear quietly. I let them wonder because explanations are overrated. My days developed a rhythm: work, early long walks, learning how to enjoy my own company without narrating it to anyone. The sixth twist arrived quietly when my ex called again, not crying, not apologizing, just practical. She had lost her new job before it really began because her reputation traveled faster than she did. She wanted advice, which would have been funny if it was not so revealing. I listened and told her something honest and final, that rebuilding starts with accepting consequences without trying to trade them away. She thanked me, and for the first time I believed it was genuine. After that call, I felt something close to closure, not because she suffered, but because I no longer felt responsible for teaching the lesson. At work, my new role exposed patterns that reminded me how common silent compromises really are, and how rare it is for someone to say no when money whispers. I became known as someone who asked uncomfortable questions calmly, and that reputation protected me better than any title. Socially, I rebuilt carefully, choosing people who valued consistency over excitement and humor over drama. One evening, at a small gathering, someone asked if I would ever tell the full story publicly in my own words, and I said I already had by how I lived. The idea of monetizing pain suddenly felt cheap. Another moment of clarity came when I realized I no longer checked my ex social media, not out of discipline, but disinterest, which is the real finish line. The past stopped tugging at my sleeve and became something I could observe without reacting. I understood then that dignity is not loud, and revenge is not satisfying for long, but self-trust compounds quietly. The man I was before would have tried to fix everything. The man I became knew when to let systems collapse under their own weight. Looking back, I did not win because someone else lost. I won because I refused to lie to myself. The road ahead felt open, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest, and that honesty became my advantage. There was still one final layer to peel back, one last realization waiting ahead, and I could feel it approaching, not like a storm, but like a clear horizon that finally belonged to me. The final realization did not arrive dramatically. It arrived during an ordinary moment, standing in line at a grocery store, watching people scroll through their phones, chasing validation they would never admit they wanted. I realized then that betrayal only has power if it rewrites your identity, and I had refused that rewrite. The story that once defined my days had become just another chapter, and not even the most interesting one. Professionally, my work began influencing policy beyond my company, and quietly shaping how accountability was measured, which felt like turning a scar into a tool. The seventh twist was internal and subtle. I no longer needed to be right in every room because I was right with myself. My ex faded into the background, not erased, but no longer central. And when mutual friends mentioned her, I felt nothing, which is the most honest verdict of all. One afternoon, I received a message from a young analyst, thanking me for showing that ethics and ambition do not have to cancel each other out. And I understood then that impact does not require applause. Evenings became peaceful. Not because nothing happened, but because I trusted my reactions. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never take place, and started planning trips I actually wanted to take. The house was sold and replaced with a smaller place, filled only with what I needed, and that simplicity mirrored my thinking. Sometimes I would catch myself smiling for no reason, and realize it was because there was nothing to brace for. The tension was gone. I reflected on how easily I could have chosen bitterness or spectacle, and how heavy that would have become. Instead, I chose documentation, patience, and timing, and those choices carried me forward without drama. The people who mattered stayed, the people who did not faded, and neither required explanation. I learned that exposure is not the same as revenge, and that integrity does not shout. It simply remains. As the year closed, I stood on a balcony watching the city lights again. But this time without questions, without plans, fueled by reaction, just a steady sense of direction. The story that began with a number on a screen ended with something far more valuable: clarity. There is one final part to this, not a twist, but a conclusion, and it deserves the same calm honesty that carried me here. If you stayed with me this long, you might be expecting a final confrontation, a dramatic apology, or some perfectly framed moment where everyone gets exactly what they deserve. Real life rarely offers that kind of symmetry, and honestly, it does not need to. The true ending of this story is quieter and stronger. My ex and I eventually spoke one last time, not to reopen wounds, but to close the door properly. She did not ask for forgiveness, and I did not offer it. Because forgiveness is not always the point, understanding is. We acknowledged that choices were made, lines were crossed, and consequences followed, and that was enough. Her former boss disappeared into consulting anonymity, which felt appropriate for someone who confused authority with entitlement. The systems he relied on changed, and that mattered more than his personal outcome. As for me, I did not become harder. I became clearer. I learned that loyalty without boundaries is not virtue, and silence in the face of compromise is not peace. The marriage ended, but my sense of self did not. It sharpened. I no longer measured success by income or appearances, but by how well I slept and how rarely I needed to explain myself. People sometimes ask if I regret making everything public, and I tell them the truth: I regret trusting without verifying. But I do not regret choosing transparency once the truth was in my hands. Secrets protect power, not people, and I refuse to be a quiet accomplice in my own erasure. Today, my life is smaller on the surface, fewer obligations, fewer performances, but richer where it counts. I wake up knowing that my name is attached to my values, and that alignment is rare and worth defending. This story is not about revenge or humiliation. It is about refusing to trade dignity for comfort. Betrayal tried to turn me into a bystander in my own life, and instead it gave me the clearest mirror I have ever had. I stepped away from what was broken and built something honest in its place. That is not a dramatic ending, but it is a real one, and it is the kind that lasts